So what is Cayin's RU7? Well, for people who have just dropped into this video randomly, this is a portable USB, playback device. You plug it into, say, a computer or a phone via USB. You plug in some, say, nice in-ear monitors on the other end, and you get good quality sound, hopefully a fair bit better than you would get, say, using the headphone output of a phone or, say, laptop computer. And, well, yeah, that's the general idea. Now, of course, it's a fair bit more expensive than, say, your average, what we call dongle DAC. And the reason is, if you think your average dongle DAC, or even the really good quality ones, use basically a phone DAC chip in them. And this is, probably a nicer one of what you get this Luxury&Precision W4. But more or less, they just use a generic thing that you might find in an actual phone, and maybe some little bit better circuitry and maybe a little bit more power supply, so you can power even full-sized headphones a little bit better, but they don't do anything particularly dramatic and special. This, however, uses some funky technology called, it says on the front, it uses a discrete 1-bit DAC. And so today I'm going to explain what that is and what that technology does, as simply as I can, considering it's a little bit complex. Well, actually, the design is simple, but the execution is complex. And then I'm going to take you through, its usage and how I felt it sounded with, some fancy-looking in-ear monitors, for those people who don't know what they are. For those people who do, they'll recognize them. And full-sized headphones as well. So let's get started. Well, to start with, let's look at what this actually is. Now, we previously saw Cayin's RU6. And this used a series, an R2R DAC, and this is based on something, you might have seen 20 years ago or more generally, which is a resistor ladder DAC that was found in the kind of, high-end digital to analog converters and CD players at the time. Although those digital to analog converter R2R DACs resided on chips from, say, Analog Devices or Burr Brown, in this case they used a series of high quality resistors to make a little resistor ladder, and this had some interesting abilities and some kind of difficulties in getting that executed, but still it's quite a marvel and is quite a popular device, even though it does draw a lot of power from, say, if you're using it with a phone, because you have to have power that resistor ladder, and you can't use the phone's volume because that screws up the sound, and the volume control was even a resistor ladder as well because of those limitations. But still, the sound quality made it really popular, and I'll talk about how it sounds versus the RU7 later. This uses another trick from old school high-end audio, which is a 1-bit DAC. Now, actually, this has become popular recently, there's a TAC DAC available that uses a 1-bit resistor ladder instead of a DAC chip, and this uses a similar system. Now, the interesting thing is that 1-bit resistor ladders are stupidly simple. I mean, they're so simple. I've seen online people build their own, just getting out what's called a breadboard, basically a board for hooking up components in the most simplest possible way, and then just putting in a series of resistors and a couple of other components, and there you are. The problem is that audio isn't 1-bit. Audio is multi-bit. Well, let's actually say 16-bit or 24-bit, and has, your frequency of 44.1 kilohertz or greater. 1-bit audio is only 1 bit, and it is at least 64 times or normal sample rate. So instead of being 44,100 hertz, it is 2.8 megahertz. And you also have DSD 128 and DSD 256, which DSD being the commercial name for 1-bit audio. And those use 128 or 256 times the normal sample rate of PCM audio, but with only 1 bit. And they also have gigantic file sizes. And being that they have gigantic file sizes, if you want to convert PCM into 1-bit audio to playback on this, then you also need a lot of processing power because data throughput is quite large. I mean, for a DSD 512 file, I saw it putting through at least 3 megabytes a second through my network connection, which may not sound like a lot compared to what networks can do, but for something this kind of size, which is also using only phone power and has to power maybe even full-sized headphones as well, that's a lot. Thankfully, there are some decent chips available nowadays, and we saw that inside the N7, which has a upsampling chip which can upsample to DSD 512. The RU7, however, is limited to DSD 256, and actually that's one of the limitations you have, like with the RU6, is that it draws a lot of power, and all that power sometimes you can actually hit the limit, and let's have a look at what happens. So Here we have the screen. Let's see if we can get this in where you can actually see it without reflection, because I've got lights everywhere. And if it's, apologies if it's flickering, because, well, the frequency of the camera may not match the frequency of the screen. Now it shows 48 kilohertz here because that's the throughput at the moment. And we have the phone out in there. It also has line out mode. And we have high and low gain, and it shows the volume level. Now the interesting thing, if you remember the RU6, every 10 steps it would have to use, it used the same ladder something like 10 times. So every 10 steps to go to the bottom of the ladder again, to stop your ears being blown out, it would cut the sound for a fraction of a second while it switched the ladder back. Now this only has 3 sections through the 100 volume range, so 0 to 50 before there's a slight cutout, and 50 to 80, and then 80 to 100. And that means that it's probably less of a pain in the butt in a sense than the RU6 was. But so if you're hitting the 50 mark in the volume, you'll hear a drop out in the sound very slightly, so that it can rotate the volume control back to the beginning of the ladder. If you long press the button on the top, you'll get to the settings, and of course you have high and low gain as usual, so low for IEMs, high for full-sized headphones. You can also select the upsampling, whether it's all to DSD 64, 128 or 256, and I've gone in backwards there. And you think, well, you probably obviously want the highest setting, but actually this will draw more power. And I actually have recorded a little bit of showing the difference of the power drain using just one of those basic USB meters, so it may not be perfectly accurate. So with the volume set at 44 and some IEMs plugged in, I found there was a bit of difference in there. With my iPhone 12 Pro Max, for example, if I use full-sized headphones in DSD256 mode, if I turned the volume up quite a bit, then I could sometimes get dropouts in the sound, as it was obviously drawing too much power, and I had to turn it down to DSD128 mode to get around that. However, that was not such a problem with the iPhone 15 Pro Max or my iPad mini, both of which have USB-C outputs, and I had to go kind of to the extreme with the Dan Clark Audio Expanse or Stealth and DSD256 mode, and up into like the late 90s in the volume level before I started to get dropouts with at least some of the music I listened to. The only other setting in there is whether you have phone out or line out, and line out mode will lock the volume obviously, and probably will bypass the current gain stage. It won't let me put it in line out mode without having something plugged in, so maybe that's a bit of a safety feature in there, something that Cayin are known for in other devices. But anyway, you can switch it to line out, and it will do line out both from both the 3.5mm and 4.4mm sockets, which I've experimented with using some headphone amplifiers. So in terms of functionality, it's pretty straightforward. Then all that really remains is to talk about how it sounds with in-ear monitors and full-sized headphones, and of course compared to some other interesting devices that I have in for review. One of the main factors, and the most important I'd say, is that the reason we're buying these better quality, at least even dongle DACs or even higher end gear, is to get better enjoyment out of the music we like. And to that end, we're lucky that we can have a lot of streaming services which have lossless streaming available, and even high-res streaming of our music. But you can go even further in that regard, and I talked about how this RU7 and the N7 before it can process DSD music, that is music, well, either in DSD format or even better, stuff that is recorded direct to DSD with minimal processing directly without any conversion, because normal analog to digital converters either internally or after the fact have the DSD music, how they record, processed through PCM and sometimes back into DSD, and that obviously results in some degradation. Now, Native DSD, who I'm proud to have sponsoring this video, and they're someone I asked to sponsor this video because I like what they do, not only do they produce music in native DSD format that is directly recorded to DSD with minimal processing, but they also have a variety of high-res and other recordings available from a variety of studios, and that kind of music is much more enjoyable to listen to, where you have very carefully made and minimally mastered recordings. And for example, I used to not listen to jazz at all. I had no interest in it, but when I started listening to high quality jazz recordings, I suddenly got into it into a big way, because the improvement in the recording quality made me understand how amazing that music can be. And likewise, classical music, when it is recorded to a very high standard, is just fantastic to listen to. It's been interesting lately that I've had three of the best dongle DACs that are available here, including the new Luxury&Precision W4. So it's given me an idea of what is capable out of each of these things. And the RU6 has been one of my favorites for sure. I use it with things like the Meze 109 Pros or Meze Lyrics, while not, I don't use stuff portably very much, it's kind of been, something I can plug into my iMac and listen to YouTube videos with and get good enjoyment out of it. And because it has a slightly kind of euphonic sound, a little bit, has some harmonics in there, kind of makes things sound more pleasant, and that kind of compensates nicely for the, the lower quality of YouTube audio versus, the stuff I can get through streaming services or stuff I already have. Now, the RU7 was interesting because initially it sounded, well, it reminded me a lot of those old school kind of like Sony high-end, 1-bit CD players. It had that kind of even and smooth sound and that kind of typical, what I call DSD sound, which kind of rolls off the edges of transients. You do get some bluntness on music, which some people really like, and maybe it's a little bit, arguably, some people say it's more natural, but it's actually less natural. So you do lose some sharpness on the sound. Now this, and Cayin advised me of this, and I confirmed it by doing so, needs some hours of use before it starts to come good. And after a few hours of use, it actually sounded worse to the point I didn't want to listen with it. And it was only after, I think, a few days of running it, just literally continuously playing music, that it actually started to come good. And after kind of many days of running this thing, and usually using it after about at least 10 minutes of warm-up so it can warm up a bit, the sound overall is kind of fairly detailed as far as, a dongle DAC goes. It's obviously a step up from your average kind of ESS-based one that, just sounds like a BTR5. But it kind of adds a smoothness to the sound that in some cases can be very pleasant and in some cases can be too much. So it has really good performance with in-ear monitors. It doesn't matter if I'm using something super sensitive like the good old ARAs, or I'm using something that requires kind of some good drive. If I can find the stuff floating around my desk. I was just listening with the good old A8000s here from Final, which why they're not coiled up. Or actually, what really worked nicely was even with the sharp kind of sharper, more BA-like treble of the original Campfire Solaris, which I really like, it added a nice balance of smoothness to that. However, sometimes when you do want real punch and sharpness to the sound, it kind of can be a little too smooth. Now compare that to, say, the RU6, which makes everything sound kind of full, and that's all that even order harmonic, or maybe even third order harmonic that makes the sound kind of bigger and fuller. But it was a slight bit less refined sounding than the N7, which sounded kind of more smooth and more pleasant. It was more, on the edge of things. Sometimes I just wanted to pick up the N7 and enjoy the smoothness of it. But sometimes after, initially while it sounded good, sometimes could sound a little bit too rolled off. And that's a problem with DSD has, because you're using a high frequency oscillator to, decide how much the signal is rising or falling. You're not actually measuring the volume level at a particular point in time. That means things like initial transients can be delayed, and that's why you get that kind of rolled off sound. Now, even with DSD-256 upsampling, that still meant, a little bit of degree of kind of roll, the edge of transients on instruments was slightly rolled off, which again, sometimes was pleasant to be a little bit softer. Some people like that, and sometimes wasn't quite as nice. Now, the interesting thing was the chip in this seems to do better than the good old Onkyo HF player, which had a DSD upsampler in it. So I decided to try, out of curiosity, comparing it to the HQ player DSD upsampler. Now, HQ player 5, it's very sophisticated software, it's very complex. It has a steep learning curve, but if you know about digital, it can be really helpful. It has a DSD upsampler, which is very, very good. Enough that it convinced me to actually use the DSD ladders and some R2R DACs as a preference over just listening to normal, the PCM upsampling. And the result in V5, they have a couple of particular what are called modulators, DSD modulators, that convert PCM to DSD, that's regular music, to 1-bit audio. And I tried it with the RU7 with very interesting results. Now, the RU7 by default has a slight bloominess to the sound. So kind of like the bass mids are a little bit kind of bloomy sounding overall. And using HQ Player instead to do the upsampling rather than the inbuilt chip resulted in that bloominess disappearing. So it sounded a little bit more clear and a little bit more accurate. Not as detailed, of course, as something like the good old N7. That's just not going to happen. But it cleaned up that the sound pretty nicely as far as something like this can do. And so that gave me a feeling that the chip in this is actually doing a pretty decent job. I mean, if you go from DSD 64 to DSD 256, you'll notice a little bit more clarity with the upsampling chip inside this, but it wasn't quite so dramatic, and I think if I'd left it on DSD64 and forgot about it, I wouldn't even notice if I just was taking it somewhere and listening. So the RU6 sounds a little bit more full, a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit more fun, but a little bit less refined than the RU7, a little bit smoother, a little bit more refined, but kind of loses a little bit of that kind of character to the music. Loses a little bit of that, that terrible audiophile term, musicality, but just a bit. Whereas, say, something like the W4, well, I'll talk about more of that in its own review. This is more, this is one of those designs that was made to be, super high cyanide, measurement dialing kind of thing, and it uses 4 combined phone chips, basically, 4 of the chips that are in the W2, which is a clever idea and quite interesting. And it has a kind of super clear sound, but really does sound like someone put 4 phone audio chips inside a dongle DAC. It really does sound that way. So sometimes it can sound really kind of sharp and clear, and then sometimes it's a little bit, because the phone DACs are limited by the kind of quality of the digital filter in there, it does sound a little touch maybe unnatural. I wouldn't say touch digital. It actually does it pretty well, especially after a lot of hours of use. I'll talk about more of that in its own video. So if you kind of think of it this way, let's do a clarity thing. This is kind of more clear, sharp and clear, RU7 in the middle, and then RU6 on the end. It's kind of like, your Cayin RU6 is like your audio GD DAC. The RU7 is, I suppose it's going to be more like that TAC or old school Sony 1-bit DAC. And your Luxury and Precision is more like, I don't know, one of those more modern, well, not ESS, because I don't really like the ESS sound so much, but one of those more modern DACs, but of course we're using Cirrus Logic DACs in here. Your toppings, your Chinese things that are made to measure really well, but still sound pretty clear. And so there's a kind of graduation in terms of how they all sound together. Now, in terms of driving power, the RU7 has, I think it was 400 milliwatts of output through the balanced output, max. Whereas the RU6 was 213, if I recall, and I can't remember what the W4 is, I'm going to have to go and look it up. One of the things that Andy Kong talked about is that the headphone driving output of this has more power. The interesting thing is, just for fun, I plugged in Dan Clark Audio's Expanse headphones, which are very demanding. They're 13 ohm and they have a really low sensitivity. So it really put a lot of demand on these things to run them. And then actually they performed pretty well, all things considered, even though there's kind of, I'm old school and I think, well, portable gear isn't really designed for listening with high quality headphones. I was actually surprised how well these things did. Now, I pushed them to the point that they would drop out. So I actually have a little one of those cheap USB meters, and I plugged that in line with a good USB hub to my computer. Actually, if you're curious, a Vornix hub, which is actually used for signal generators and with a good power, an i5 power supply in this case, so I could get their best performance out of them and compare it to the performance versus a phone or whatever. And I think the Cayin actually didn't cut out. It actually hit about 500 milliwatts of power being delivered to this, not just into the headphones, I don't know. And it just wouldn't drop out at all. It just hit the maximum volume of 100 with the Expanse and started getting a little bit kind of harsh, and I bet the measurements of it at that kind of power demand are probably going to be unpleasant. I got the Cayin to drop out, it would start dropping out over about 400 and something milliwatts. So that's, of course, the draw for the whole thing here, including the DSD processing. So I think I got it to peak at some point at 500 or something like that. So it was interesting that I could get the actual throughput of power, and noting that probably the amount of the demand on the electronics would be different, I could get them to max out at 100 volume and then get the Cayin to drop out with the Expanse out of a computer or a powered hub. Out of a phone, no chance in heck with the Expanse. With regular, less demanding full-sized headphones, your Meze Lyric, or especially IEMs as well, no problem there, because the volume level was down, way low, 40s to 70s or something like that, depending on the music. And I didn't have any problems, except, as I mentioned, once I got to my iPhone and maybe some music at DSD256, I could get things to start to drop out, but generally no problem. With IEM users, you're not going to have that ever happen. So, you know, of course, with a full-size computer and probably some an Android DAP or something like that, something that can provide a lot of current without, you know, so many limitations, because Apple does tend to limit their stuff, it's unlikely you're going to have any kind of dropout at all. A bit of a bonus, someone asked me how this compares to something like FIO's BTR7. Now, the BTR7 obviously has a battery, and it has pretty good headphone drive as well, and of course it doesn't require drawing power from something like a phone to operate. So I plugged it in via USB and did listen to the same music, and overall, like, it had good headphone drive, but the digital to analog conversion was kind of more, well, lower quality basically. It wasn't bad as such, but it had that kind of, that ESS tech kind of edginess to it. It sounded more digital. It didn't sound as pleasant at all compared to the smoothness and the kind of detail you get from the RU7. So it was an interesting comparison. I still think that as terms of value, the BTR7 is pretty good. But yeah, again, it's more something you would get for the advantage of using it with Bluetooth, whereas that drop in sound quality is not such an issue because you've already got a little bit of a drop in sound quality from Bluetooth. I mean, the idea of not having something that like this as a Bluetooth device is that you're getting the maximum sound quality through a wired connection, whereas Bluetooth is always going to be lossy. The next thing, and probably critical, that I get asked about is how does it compare to Chord's original Mojo? Where does it stand in kind of the whole scheme of things? Now, people are obviously hoping that some kind of amazing miracle dongle DAC would come along and dethrone all these, like, various other devices and DAPs and what have you. And I'd probably say this is nicer to listen with than, say, a FIO M11S. I mean, it's just smoother and nicer, and maybe even an M11 Plus. But I'll tell you, Mojo, no, the Mojo is still better. Now, of course, yeah, it's battery powered. It has a substantial battery inside, and it can drive full-sized headphones better, obviously, as a result. And, well, just the sheer computing power in there and the quality of the programming and the technology in there is just, well, superior. And now it's not dramatically so, but, the overall clarity, the overall depth, the overall realism of the sound is still better with a regular Mojo. And a Mojo 2, well, yeah, we're not even going to get anywhere near there. So, in case you're wondering, so a Mojo is still going to be better, but it's not going to be as light and as convenient as something like the RU7 or even the RU6 as things go. And of course, as long as you have a device that can supply enough power for as long as you want to listen, because this drained my iPhone 12 Pro Max pretty fast. But anyway, that was an interesting one as well. So it's considering that they cost a fair bit more than something like a BTR7, you would expect better sound quality. And you're getting some really sophisticated technology going in here. I mean, no one else would ever dare to do something like an R2R dongle DAC, a 1-bit dongle DAC. This is pretty crazy stuff. And probably a lot of that is, first of all, because Cayin went to a manufacturer and actually got high quality precision resistors made so that it was possible. They went through the engineering efforts, and they also could find that chip that could do DSD upsampling in the case of the N7, and that allowed the technology to come through, and I think that's a good thing. So people ask, if I already have an RU6, should I get an RU7? Well, probably no. I'd say unless that the volume switching every 10 steps annoys you, yeah, or something like that, then there's no real need to get something like this. If you want a little bit more headphone power, at least on paper, you could get this, but I found that I still got good results out of the RU6. If you want a bit of a smoother, kind of cleaner sound than the RU6 delivers, maybe then get the RU7, especially if you have, say, something like, I really like them with a Solaris. You want a slightly smoother sound. Now, people call it more natural. It's not. That's a wrong thing. It's less natural, but it can be more pleasant to listen with. It's why we listen to things like this and the RU6 and tube amps. We enjoy it. It's not because it actually is more natural, if you've ever heard live music. If you think something like the W4 would maybe sound a little bit too sharp and too clear, which it can sometimes, then maybe the RU7 might be a little bit more preferable. Do you have one of these things? Do you have any of these dongle DACs? Do you have any useful information? Please do post in the comments below, because I think that people should not just take my word for things. It's helpful if people who actually own a device post as well, so that people who are looking to buy these kinds of devices can actually get as much information as possible before they make a purchasing decision, where they may not have a chance to listen beforehand.